And welcome. You're watching Setting the Agenda. It's a unique collaboration between the Voice of America and WION. World is One. We're joining you live from VOA studios in New York City. It's 8 o'clock in the morning here. I'm Ira Mellman from VOA.
And I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay from WION. World is One. It's been an action-packed week here at the United Nations in New York. The 74th session of the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, saw some really powerful speeches, some rhetoric, and of course there were some blunders as well.
A message of peace.
अंतर्राष्ट्रीय समुदाय के लिए है harmony and peace.
A misinformation campaign.
India keeps accusing us that there are these groups there. I would like the United Nations to send observers to see for themselves what we've done.
A desperate need for approval.
The United States is now taking that decisive action to end this grave economic injustice. Our goal is simple. We want balanced trade that is both fair and reciprocal.
A stern ultimatum.
فقط کافی است به جای نمایش مذاکره به واقعیت مذاکره بازگردید. عکس یادگاری آخرین ایستگاه مذاکره است و نه اولین ایستگاه.
Ducked questions. Unscheduled flights. Cry for attention. Trending statements.
He's like an American version of Elvis. It was like we brought in the middle of an all-American deal. Elvis Presley came back.
An anguished outcry.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
And a shameless rebut.
Above all, we must let our children be children. Let our kids be kids. While we do the work positively together to deliver the practical solutions for them and their future.
It was an action-packed week at New York. Nearly 200 leaders, over 600 meetings, some sharp statements, and some faux pas. On the show today, we take a look at all the highlights from the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly.
And joining us in the studio is Mehmet Kilic. He is the president of the Journalists and Writers Foundation. Good morning, Mehmet.
Good morning.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. The 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly has just concluded. 600-odd meetings involving 200 world leaders in 5 days. We saw a lot of action. Was this session any different from the previous ones, and how so?
Well, I think like this 74th session of the United States, civil society organizations got together to discuss the progress made on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think like this session of the UN General Assembly is very impactful in terms of climate change. The climate summit that the world leaders got together to discuss the disaster that's going on all around the world. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge Greta Thunberg, that she became like the person of action in terms of climate change, not only in the US nations, but throughout the world. And she got together so many young people to take action in achieving the, like SDGs, in particular climate change.
So if a teenager became the biggest headliner at a gathering of so many world leaders, what does it say about the leadership of the world right now? And many say that the United Nations may have been reduced to becoming a talking shop. So much has been said, but do we see any action?
The world leaders, they have to keep their promises. So United Nations General Assembly meeting is not to make promises or commitments by the world leaders. But at the same time, I have to quote UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres that the SDGs is it's a global agenda, and the world leaders and the civil society, the people, they have to take action. And I think Greta Thunberg is a great example of people action, taking action on the climate change.
Media coverage of the United Nations has changed with the way media operates around the world. How can something like climate change be pushed forward as far as media coverage is concerned? And that's, our job is to maintain objectivity and show both sides. Obviously the United States and President Donald Trump is not in favor of much. There is a worldwide group saying we have to do it and have to do it now. It's not covered. I was going to say it's not covered that much in the United States, but it is. But on a worldwide level, which you are able to see, can media contribute to what the UN really wants to do?
I think media plays a great role in terms of dissemination of information. And UNDPI, it's a department at the United Nations that works with the media, journalists all over the world to disseminate what's going on at the United Nations. But unfortunately, some media is paying attention to some domestic policies. Other than the mainstream media, now we have social media. Social media can play a big role in terms of reaching out what's going on, not at the global level, but at the local level as well. But of course, social media and mainstream media should a voice to other issues, and climate change is one of them. And we are we are seeing the effects of climate change in our localities. I mean, nowadays, the sea levels is rising. The temperature is rising, and I know that many countries in South Asia and the Pacific are losing their land to the sea levels, and that's a huge impact there. Sometimes we think that when it is not impacting our localities, we don't really pay attention to it. But now these global goals are global, that impact everybody, not only environmentally, but it is impacting us in terms of economy and social aspects as well.
Well, the challenges are clear and in some cases even common, like climate change. The Indian Prime Minister spoke about multilateralism. US President Donald Trump spoke about the trade war. The Iranian president spoke about American sanctions. Is it possible to bunch as a force when every leader is guided mostly by his or her domestic agenda?
I think we're talking about transforming our world. But everybody has their opinions and their benefits and their ideas. But when we talk about transforming the whole world, I think the only platform that all these ideas or these agendas can be discussed is the United Nations. And again, I want to quote the Secretary General. He said, there are a lot of problems in the world. And then he says, at the United Nations, we are here to serve. I think all these agendas, they should come to the United Nations to be discussed and to find solutions.
Find solutions, but apply solutions. Is the United States, is the United Nations strong enough now on a world scale to be able to accomplish anything?
But of course, United Nations is a political organization. Sovereignty and independence. Sometimes these things are conflicting between the United Nations commitments, but at the same time, the countries their own independence. So it's not easy. It's very complex to solve these problems globally. But I think, like many people, they question the existence of the United Nations. Is the United Nations effective? But I ask, is there any other alternative to the United Nations? At least now we have this, and I think this is a way to solve the problems. And I think, the leaders, we have to listen to the scientists. I think, what I like about what Greta said is that don't listen to me, listen to the scientists. So world leaders, they should be apolitical, but listen to the scientists and what they say about climate change, let's say.
Are there changes that you think can be made to the way the United Nations operates to make it more?
I think there are ways to solve the problems at United Nations. And one of the things is that we have to look at the challenges from a global perspective rather than a national or a regional perspective. Of course, when we look at climate change, it's different in the US than it is in India or in Russia or, let's say, Australia. So when we look at it from a global perspective, then I think we will have a better understanding.
Well, politics make it different.
It is.
The threat is still there.
It is, exactly.
So that is one approach that the United Nations can work together. But within the United Nations, there are problems. And I want to go back to what you said earlier, that do we have another system? That's like saying that a system that doesn't work is perhaps better than no system at all. Why not make this system work? Why not work towards United Nations reforms? Because this organization was set up almost 100 years ago. It has changed since then, and the world leaders have changed since then. So why not bring it in tune with the times? What is holding back the United Nations from implementing the reforms that everyone has been talking about for a long time now?
But I think, again, when we question United Nations is not implementing these goals.
No,
it
I'm
is
not
the
talking
member
about the goals.
states.
I'm talking about the structure of the United Nations, the countries which form which have the permanent membership of the Security Council, and the countries which do not, and the countries which have a veto power, and the countries which do not, and that skews the power balance in favor of some. And that may not be true for the geopolitical equations that exist elsewhere. There are other nations which are contributing much more. For instance, the Indian Prime Minister spoke about India's contribution to the UN peacekeeping forces. So when there are countries that are contributing so much to UN efforts, then they should have a say, which is.
Yeah, I mean, it is an area, I mean, it is a topic that is being discussed at United Nations in terms of the structure of the United Nations Security Council. The 5 permanent representatives, members, and then the 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council. And it is unfortunate that the permanent members are not in agreement, in solving conflicts. I mean, let's say the Syrian refugee crisis is one of the issues that has been going on for so many long, and so many, like millions of people are displaced, lost their lives. And the world leaders should put the people in the center of the agenda rather than their political gains or their political agendas. And every country has their benefits. And I would like to, just bring it to what Tushar Gandhi, who was one of our speakers at the UNGA conference, what he said about transforming our world. Transforming our world should not serve our benefits or should not others. So when countries and leaders, they think about the people in conflict zone, let's say, then it will be a better, solutions to the conflicts, let's say. But otherwise, if we look at the situation from an economic or political perspective, then every country has their own position.
You are president of the Journalist and Writers Foundation, and I want to get back to media and how media handles that. How has the media coverage changed? Is it successful, and what further can be done to make it more communicative and to tell people what's actually happening?
I think the media has to be inclusive, that we should include everybody in terms of reaching out the information. And media plays a big role, but I think media, they come to the United Nations and they make coverages of what's going on in the United Nations. The headlines are taking more coverage than other issues that are more concerning to the local communities.
Well, we're in a headline society.
Yes, it is. And also, I think what has changed in the media is that in the beginning, previously probably you would know, maybe a president or a prime minister would have 2 minutes or 3 minutes of talking time, but now with the headlines, they only get like 30 seconds. So you have to say things that are more highlights rather than the details. So people do not really get much about the details other than the headlines.
But that's where it is. Again, what should be and what is still has fight against each other at all times. And how then can you communicate? Do you use social media more? How do you get to the whole world? Because there doesn't seem to be an answer.
Well, I spoke, I was at the Thomson Reuters Foundation on Tuesday, and one of the things that has been discussed for media is the information security. And the media is using different tools for communication. Sometimes they're using WhatsApp or some other, tools for communication. I think we are getting a lot of information from different sources. But when we get this, information from different sources, the credibility of the information is another question. So again, people are now paying more attention to the messages that is being shared through social media. But I think the mainstream media or the news channels, newspapers, they are more credible in terms of. But of course, when the mainstream media is covering stories, and then stories that take the headlines, that's what they hear about mostly.
One word on the role of the protesters. I was present outside the UN building, and I saw people from all over the world, from Togo, from Nigeria, there was the Falun Gong group from China, and they all came with banners. They all came prepared. And some of them said that they've been coming here for years now. Do they have a place in this dialogue at the United Nations, or do they just contribute to the landscape?
I think people would like to be heard by the world leaders, but unfortunately there is not much people participation at the United Nations. That's why we organize the UNGA conference every year, to bring the civil society organizations, people to speak about what is more important. And I've seen so many people that they were protesting in front of the United Nations, and there are so many human rights violations going on all around the world, and then there is not much media coverage of these human rights violations. And people are freely practicing their right to freedom of speech and expression here in the United States, which we have democracy. But unfortunately, in some countries, people do not have this right to speak up their mind. The United Nations here is a great platform for civil society to play a role in achieving the SDGs, and also talk about different global challenges. But of course, do we get into the United Nations? It is not easy, because there is, a whole blockage of the United Nations on 2nd Avenue, and then people are protesting just beyond it. And so society should be more active in organizing events that would, bring different world leaders to their events, and to, have them hear what is important to them. That's what we're doing as the Journalist and Writers Foundation, organizing this UNGA conference annually to bring, world leaders, not only world leaders, but community leaders, business leaders, and academics to talk about different issues. And for example, this year we talked about transforming our world, inclusive social development for all. So this agenda is not only for governments to achieve, it is the civil society, private sector, intellectual organizations and institutions. We all have to work all together to solve these problems. And at the same time, I think we have to bring some best practices to the United Nations. Sometimes there are great projects that's going on in different local communities, and people really do not hear about this year, different projects that are contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of them are about organic biofarming. Some of them are youth empowerment, peace building. Some others are about women empowerment and issues. So we are trying to mobilize people to come to the United Nations. I know it's not easy. It takes a lot of difficult finances and other things, but that's the way to raise our voices as a civil society.
In the minute or so we have left, what is the central role of the United Nations? The major stories, U.S., China, but what's happening obviously between India and Pakistan, that is being talked about. What can the UN handle the best right now?
I think United Nations, one of the main goals is to maintain peace and security, international peace. And then we need multilateral diplomacy in solving the problems. And I think that's the main objective of the United Nations, that we prevent further wars or conflicts throughout the world. And I think, many people are scared where the world is going. And so there are so many conflicts, and we don't want any more conflicts in the world. And but of course now we're moving into economic wars. What's happening between China and U.S. is impacting not only the people in the U.S. or in China, but it's impacting whole economies, the whole world. I think, the United Nations should, play, have a stronger voice in terms of bringing world leaders together that benefits, that puts people in the first place rather than our political agendas.
And how that is carried out? How can that be done against very strong forces which are trying to make their own messages go through without the United Nations? So what do we do?
Yes, and before we wrap, very quickly I want to ask you, do you think the United Nations will work better and be more effective if the resolutions are enforceable?
I think the world leaders, they have to keep their promises, and when they make pledges, when they make commitments, they have to follow it. If the world leaders are not following, and then the media and then civil society, they have to follow their pledges or their commitments.
Can the UN hold them accountable?
They should be accountable. Of course, the UN should be, hold them accountable, and the UN is trying to get progress made from every country. But every country is, disclosing what achievements are being achieved. But UN should be, doing more work to keep them accountable.
Right, Mehmet Kilic.
Well, we thank you very much for being with us, and since this is our last program of this week, yes, I just wanted to thank you and your entire crew from WION to be with us. Thank you to all of our guests. Hopefully we have made some communication, which we tried to talk about today. And I am I'm very happy to have met you, your entire crew, and we go from here, hopefully.
Yes, you're very kind, Ira. Thanks very much, and we hope this conversation is going to lead to some real change as we look ahead to the next UNGA session. We'll see how much progress the world has made. Thank you all from Ira and I. This was Setting the Agenda, a special production brought to you by the Voice of America. I hope you enjoyed this show. Thank you, and have a lovely weekend.